Hi there. My name is Jason Grindstaff, and I'm Assistant Professor of Health and Human Performance here at Cumberland University in Lebanon, Tennessee. So today we're talking about stress and how stress affects the human body during performance in sport contexts. I think we all know the experience of being in high pressure situations, characterized by the profuse sweating, increased heart rate, our breathing rate goes up. There's a number of physical signs. But as well, we also know the experience, I think most of us do, as embarrassing as it might sound, in a silly example, but there's decreased blood flow to the urinary system under stress. That's why we have the tendency to, you gotta feel like you gotta go to the bathroom more often. But we also know in sports psych research that that athletes tend to experience this tunnel vision under stress. That literally our peripheral vision starts to narrow, and we kind of hone in on our more of our focal vision during that time. So we're going to be talking about those experiences today, and all of this is in the context of Chapter 4, our textbook, which is Arousal, Stress, and Anxiety. So let's go ahead and get started. There are 5 key objectives that we want to be able to cover in this video series. And actually, we're just going to focus on the first 3 of those objectives. We're going to look at and explain how anxiety and arousal affect performance. We're going to compare and contrast the key concepts related to it. So in other words, we're going to define arousal, stress, and anxiety. And then third, as we wrap up this particular video, we're going to summarize some of the methods for measuring arousal and anxiety. So when we look at, how arousal and how anxiety influence performance, a couple of key things come up. The first is that athletes tend to experience increased muscle tension. They fatigue easily. And then as well, there's motor performance suffers. There's coordination difficulties. So when we're out there on the field and you're experiencing stressful situations, when your anxiety is high, your motor production isn't as fluid. What else we notice is that there tends to be a psychological component as well. There's changes in attention and how we concentrate. We had just mentioned that narrowing of the peripheral vision. Literally, if you take your hands all the way out to your side and you begin to pull them in, that point where you first see your fingertips, that's your peripheral vision out there. Our focal vision is what we key in on. But what we notice in the sports psych literature is that athletes that experience anxiety, or really anyone that experiences anxiety, under heightened states of arousal and anxiety, that peripheral vision starts to narrow. We start getting this tunnel vision. There's also a shift in dominant style. This relates to Niederfer's model of attentional focus, where our 2 continuums are from internal and external, and then from broad to narrow. So you probably learn about that a little bit more in a motor learning literature, motor learning class, but particularly each athlete tends to have more of a dominant style and will tend to, under heightened states of anxiety, shift to one or a different particular dimensional focus there. And as well, the third change in attention and concentration comes in the form of starting to pay attention to inappropriate cues, task irrelevant cues. So athletes might become focused more on a coach on the sideline, or the parents in the stands that are yelling, or things that are off the court, off the field, things that don't even matter for competition right then and there, schoolwork, other pressures that might come at an athlete. So we tend to see these physical and we see these psychological changes that happen under heightened states of arousal and anxiety. But let's break those 2 terms down a little bit, because they're not exactly the same. They're related to one another, but when we use the term arousal, what we mean by that particularly are those psychological and physiological activation of the human body. That tends to vary along a continuum. And we'll come back to this slide, but let's look at this continuum here. So the continuum looks at, on one end, we have deep sleep, and all the way on the other end, extremely excited. So we have low physiological arousal and high physiological arousal. So that's what we're looking at with arousal. Well, how does that differ from anxiety? Well, actually, anxiety is a negative emotional state. And this comes from typically our appraisal. or the cognitive component of arousal. So anxiety typically has that negative connotation, and that it includes the emotional state. And what is that characterized by? Well, it's the feelings of worry, the nerves, and the apprehension that comes with how we interpret that physiological arousal. Two concepts that come up when we talk about anxiety tend to be the idea of state anxiety and trait anxiety. And there is a difference between the two in the sense that state anxiety, somebody that has high state anxiety, that's the right here, right now component of anxiety. Whereas someone else might have high trait anxiety, and that tends to be more the personality disposition, or that enduring characteristic, and that remains relatively stable over time. And so what we might see is that somebody might have relatively low trait anxiety in general, but in a very specific sport context have high state anxiety. For example, pre-performance anxiety going into a really big competition. But what we do know as well that people that tend to have high trait anxiety also have high state anxiety in very specific right here, right now situations. So how do we measure anxiety and arousal? Well, we could do that on the physiological level. There's a lot of ways to do that. We could actually measure somebody's heart rate. We can measure respiration. We can measure that galvanic skin conductance response and other biomarkers, utilizing blood profiles, for example. We can use more subjective measures, self-report measures. The sport anxiety scale might be an example of those. So if you're following along in the textbook, take a look at page 79 and 80 for examples of some of those multidimensional self-report scales. When we talk about signs and symptoms, it's important that we understand what the difference is between the two of those. Let's move this here. That we understand the difference between a sign and a symptom. Signs are something that could be observed by a third party. So if I am observing you, if I'm your coach and I observe you at practice, I can't exactly see your negative self-talk. But I could see that if you were constantly, for example, going back and forth to the bathroom and then coming back to practice, that might be a sign of anxiety. Whereas on the other hand, a symptom is something that has to be self-reported. I could only let you know if I have, for example, dry mouth, unless you actually opened up somebody's mouth and looked in there. That'd be a little strange. Or if I had an upset stomach. If I'm kind of bent over and I'm holding my stomach and I look ill, now that probably becomes a sign. But just know the distinction between signs, which is observable by a third party, and a symptom, which has to be self-reported. But these are some of the signs and symptoms, certainly not an exhaustive list, but some of the signs and symptoms of anxiety. So now let's move on and let's actually define stress. Our textbook defines stress as kind of this balancing act, that it tends to be this substantial imbalance between one and two things. The first are the demands. So we think of these as physical and psychological demands. We'll call this the stressor. Okay, so it's something in the environment that is causing us to experience that perception of stress. So it tends to be this imbalance between the demand and the ability of the body of a human being to respond to that stressor. And it typically follows four distinct steps. So we talk about this as being the stress process. And we just mentioned a moment ago about that environmental demand. So we might use an example of Johnny is getting ready to play in the conference baseball tournament. So the conference baseball tournament is the environmental demand. Is that stressful? Well, that, according to the stress response, depends highly on Johnny's perception of the demand. So the baseball game itself, the conference championship, is neither good or bad. It is neutral. It's how Johnny perceives that game. In this case, Johnny might get really worked up. He might get really anxious because the importance of the event and the uncertainty of the event, there's a lot up in the air right now. Might perceive that as stressful. Anxiety goes up, which leads into the stress response. That's how the body physically experiences it, and not just on the physical level, but the psychological, on the cognitive level. And then the fourth component of that stress response is the behavioral consequences. So what actually happens? How does Johnny perform during that game? When we talk about sources of stress and anxiety, a couple that are pointed out in our chapter are the situational and those personal sources. So we're going to think of those situational as the environmental context. In this case, a couple of examples of those are, the event importance. In the previous example, we used Johnny was getting ready for the conference championship. So, this is a big game. Athletes tend to get a little more anxious under events that are highly important. So a conference championship, playoff games, national championships, big rivals coming up might be a really important event. And then as well, another situational factor would be the uncertainty of the event. If Johnny knows that going into that conference championship game, that they've beat the other team 10 times in a row that year by a margin of victory of 10 runs every single time, well, Johnny might not be all that nervous because the certainty of winning is a little bit higher in that case as compared to two evenly matched teams. There's also personal sources of stress. So we just talked a few moments ago about trait anxiety, that athletes that tend to have higher trait anxiety, that's more of a personality disposition, that they experience higher state anxiety in very specific situations. Athletes that have low self-esteem are quite possibly going to have an ego-oriented approach to that event, and quite possibly going to experience more anxiety. And then the textbook uses a very specific example of one type of anxiety, social physique anxiety, and that's the type of anxiety that, for example, if somebody's in a gym setting and a male or a female is uncomfortable with his or her body, they might experience the anxiety of being perceiving others as evaluating their physique. And then we're going to go into in the next video series, we're going to start taking a look at how arousal and anxiety affect performance. So we already began touching on some of the physical and the psychological components related to attention and then the motor control issues. But here we're going to break down in the next video, we're going to take a look at 4 particular theories that explain how arousal affects performance. So more on that to come. Thank you.